the end, I'm very pleased to welcome and introduce to you Professor Ann Stoller from the New School for Social Research. Professor Stoller is not only one of the most distinguished professors in anthropology, but also a worldwide recognized historian who succeeded in combining the approaches of these two disciplines in her extensive body of work. After having studied and passed her PhD examination at Columbia University, Professor Stoller worked as a research fellow at such different and faraway places as the Institut Pertanian di Bogor in Indonesia, the École des Hautes Études en Sciences Sociales in Paris, and at the Department of Non-Western Sociology of the University of Amsterdam. From 1989 till 2004, she taught anthropology, history, and women's studies at the University of Michigan in Wisconsin, interrupted by several visiting professorships in Berkeley, Stanford, and Santa Cruz. In 2004, she was nominated Willy Brandt, named after our German Chancellor. Willy Brandt, distinguished university professor of anthropology and historical sciences at the New School for Social Research in New York, where she still teaches today. From the many honors and awards she received, I will only name the Louis Henry Morgan Distinguished Lecture of 1996, because there seems to be a continuous exchange between the invitees of this lecture series and the invitees of our own. As just mentioned, Professor Stoller published an astounding range of works. She did this rather in a German or European way. This means not so many articles, but instead of this, many thick books. If I counted right, 8 to 10. Some of them also translated into French. But giving a short summary of these books' contents, or even naming only their titles, would take too much time. That should be spared for your own lecture. Instead of this, I will mention some coincidences and trajectories. Coincidences and trajectories that prompted me to invite Professor Stoller to the 2014 Jensen Memorial Lectures, which will be perhaps the last one I'm inaugurating as director of the Frobenius Institute. As most of you know, the Goethe University Department of Anthropology, which grew out of our institute and was founded by Frobenius' successor, Adolf Elegard Jensen, in 1946. The University Department of Anthropology carried the name of Institut für Historische Ethnologie, Historical Ethnology, for more than 40 years, only abolished 5 years ago in order to avoid some misunderstandings from our university administration. Actually, however, the Frankfurt department was the only one in Germany which tried always to be aware of the historical dimensions of the anthropological endeavor. It is true that to my predecessor, Eike Haberland, historische Ethnologie meant the study of the history of indigenous peoples in Africa, Oceania, and everywhere else on the world. But I myself, as many other members of the Institute, understood and understand by historische Ethnologie the study of the relations between the anthropologist and his or her so-called subjects, between the colonizers and the colonized, between people of different skin colors and different sexes, relations determined by structural inequalities and gaps of power. Some of the most important publications of our institute's members deal with these topics, my own included, but I think that no other anthropologists in the States or in Europe has a similar expertise in this field of study as Professor Stoller. Race and the education of desire, or carnal knowledge and imperial power, to name only two of her books, are masterpieces in this area, inspired by Michel Foucault's philosophical thoughts, but going much deeper in the subtle analysis of the historical sources and also avoiding the misuse of the sometimes almost incomprehensible scientific jargon that grew out of the postmodern debate. Another link between your work and the Frankfurt studies in anthropology consists in the fact that the preferred field of your studies on race and gender relations is Southeast Asia, better to say the former Dutch East Indies. Since Jensen's ethnographic expedition of 1938, the eastern part of today's Indonesia has been a focus of our institute's research, long time neglected in favor of African studies in the 1970s and 1980s, but renewed in the mid-90s and strongly continued since Professor Schröder's nomination as professor on colonial and post-colonial orders in 2008, also embracing now the study of gender relations. There's still a third trajectory I should not miss to mention, the long institutional link between the New School and the Frankfurt University. Since the New School's Theodor Heuss professorship was endowed by the German government in 1963, there was an unusual high number of Frankfurt scholars who were appointed to this chair. Jürgen Habermas was one of the first, followed later by my friend Bertram Scheffold, by Axel Honneth, Rainer Forst, Christopher Dase, and most recently by Tilman Habermas, Jürgen Habermas' son, who is here at Frankfurt and professor of psychology. Thus, I think it is only a kind of due reciprocity if after such a long time of rather unilateral exchange, we can welcome today a member of the New School faculty for our institute's Jensen Memorial Lectures. I know well that if you mention Frankfurt among New York intellectuals and professors, the first thing they will associate is the Frankfurt School of Philosophy. Only true insiders, only initiates know that the famous name of the Frankfurt School was originally the title of the Kulturmorphologische Schule founded by Leo Frobenius in 1898 and only usurped, hijacked later by these Adornos and Horkheimers. Thereafter, I think we can take it as a homage to both Frankfurt schools, the old ethnological as well as the new philosophical one, that Professor Stoller, that you baptized your 2014 Jensen Memorial Lectures Fieldwork in philosophy.
Well, thank you for that lovely introduction. Thank you for making me feel right at home. Welcome, all of you. Those of you who know my work on sexuality, on race, on colonialism, I hope you won't be disappointed by, is this too close? I have a bellowy voice, probably. Is that better? Sure. How's that? Is that better? Won't be disappointed by this lecture, which is a new foray that actually comes out of all of that work. And as these lectures proceed, I hope you will very much see that. It's also a particular delight to be here because I feel I'm moving in the wake of some of my dearest and closest friends and colleagues and mentors. Maurice Baudevier took me under his wing when I was a graduate student, when Mamadou and I were both in Paris at the same time. Jean and John Komaroff, Vincent Crapanzano, Nancy Letkehaus, and I who gave the Jensen lecture last year, 40 years of friendship, and we were in graduate school together. So it feels very fitting again and at home to be here. So let me begin. My lectures tend to be rather dense and long, and it may be that the ones that I imagine as the first two are indeed the first three. We'll see how we proceed, and I want to make sure that I leave room for discussion. When Clifford Geertz quipped in 1968 that all ethnography is part philosophy and a good deal of the rest is confession, he admittedly was targeting Levi-Strauss in a demolition essay in the New York Review of Books. Still, there was no doubt then, nor 30 years later, when he published Available Light, that philosophical topics subjected to anthropological reflections were Geertz's own favored way of describing what he saw as his rightful domain, if not that of all and any ethnographers. In 1992, David Scott could write in pithy shorthand that Geertz was philosophy's native informant, as surely as Richard Rorty was anthropology's philosopher. This did not mean that there was necessarily much dialogue between them, only that each served to provide what each discipline sought at the time. Rorty was hailed by anthropologists for retelling the story of philosophy to sound like little more than a local knowledge of Western culture, a quote from David Scott. And as Scott succinctly put it, anthropology could become epistemologically sophisticated and philosophy culturally aware. Well, these were clearly aspirations in the expectant mode, hardly achieved states. One could imagine that little has changed, Rorty and Geertz's chumminess aside. Something else, I think, is on the horizon, in part because of the very nature of ethnography and the changes it has undergone, and in part because of philosophy's law of adherence to a suspension of the ordinary, as the philosopher Adi Ophir puts it, that may be in question among philosophers themselves. Philosophy has occupied a peculiar place in the social sciences, and you might find that this is idiosyncratically Anglophone and something that we could talk about clearly later. On the one hand, it garners a commanding presence across the disciplines of social inquiry, often serving as the imprimatur of what counts as sound knowledge and the seal of what confers conceptual authority. On the other hand, plausibly, much social inquiry could be seen to pose itself as a counterweight to philosophical mandates and to the conceptual methodology sanctioned to assert them. A valorization of empirical work over abstractions that denounces philosophy's proprietary rights to arbitrate fundamental understanding of what we can know and how we do so. Well, this template is obviously too simply drawn, but it holds well enough, I think, as a contrast to something else that is transpiring, something striking and more compelling that these lectures seek to locate in that relationship today. Philosophy is positioned and present in ethnography in a fashion that it has never enjoyed before. One manifestation is a flood of explicit invocations of philosophers, appropriations of their vocabularies, and conceptual architectures. However, there is something else that shifts the frame. What I think of as, I call it, a new summons of philosophy, in the two richly bivalent senses of that term. Both a current call on philosophy's authority and its repertoire of concepts, and simultaneously a challenge to its command over concept formation and to the evidentiary sites and sources for its claims. This is not a unified and coherent impulse, nor is it activated with similar intensities or by the same research agendas. Nevertheless, in its disparate manifestations, some of its effects seem to signal what might be seen as a reconfigured and newly carved space and style of social inquiry. Even a perusal of the choice of titles of Anglophone ethnographic work in recent years might serve to make the point. The evocation of philosophy is in bold-faced type, underscoring affirmations of philosophical emphasis, alliance, and authority. 20 years ago, and I'm not sure this is the case in Germany, so we will see during the discussion. 20 years ago, we would not have found the following titles: Legacies of Derrida, 2010, Deleuze and the Anthropology of Becoming, 2010, Foucault in the Tropics, 2005, A Heideggerian Anthropology, 2001, Deleuzian Intersections, Wittgenstein and Anthropology, Anthropology, Philosophy, and Fijian Knowledge, Guattari and Anthropology, or a conference on Charles Sandra Peirce for 21st Century Anthropology, and yes, not least, Stoller's own Epistemic Politics, these being only a sliver of the range. But specific philosophers need not be named for a philosophical lexicon to assume increasing pride of place. It can't escape notice that ontology, epistemology, assemblages, eminence, being, becoming are terms that have entered our vernacular with increasing frequency and force. And as proof of their eluctability and attraction, one need only look to the way our students take our lead. These terms are splayed across graduate student papers, often multiple times on a page. Some, such as discourse and genealogy and increasingly ontology, are so commonly used that they are deemed to no longer require citation, definition, much less perfunctory demonstration that one understands their philosophical uses or sources. Well, one could dismiss this as an unremarkable convention of neophytes yearning to demonstrate and display their membership rights in the guild and to its coveted tools of the trade. But I think such a cynical dismissal leaves the fact of that presence and its ubiquity unaddressed. For what young scholars in the making are loosely picking up is something more pervasive, as they rehearse a shift in the politics of authorization and respond to the signal that anthropology's innovations are placing philosophy at the center of what were once more restricted cultural and conceptual quarters. One could retort by invoking a legend that when a discipline is in crisis, it invariably turns to philosophy. While such claims tend to travel so fast that their content can be in doubt, they do contain a grain of truth. The current philosophical turn in social inquiry may be different, as I set out to claim, a move that marks a broader set of emergent realignments, and how anthropologists see their tasks, are reimagining the scope of their field, and imagine themselves in a broader arena of social inquiry. One key feature is a repositioned attentiveness to how concepts operate in the world, and how that attentiveness shapes an ethnographic enterprise. Borrowing has long been one form of homage, but that only describes a part of this new reign. There's equally, I think, a turn away from prescribed use of, adaptation of, extraction of philosophical concepts, and a more intensive and more considered work with them. that suggests a new, if still somewhat muted, defiance of philosophical authority. A revision of those of us imagined as eligible to master, deploy, and critique these terms and speak through and about them. But it's not just in one direction. Both sets of practices are operative. The full blast appropriation on the one hand, as we see so often in the ways in which a-colonial discourse is invoked to describe a coherent mindset, the precise opposite of Foucault's own description of discursive formations, with their disparate, contradictory, and embattled qualities. And on the other, historically rich and revised assessments of how to rework and rethink concepts that are too ready at hand, as Janet Reutemann does in her recent treatment of the omnipresent concept of crisis, or in the measured analysis of Stephen Collier and Andrew Lakoff bring to the conception of preparedness or biosecurity, or that range of anthropologists bring to humanitarianism. In this drive towards more philosophically rooted and mannered analysis, at issue is whether ethnography and history become further subsumed to philosophy's rubrics, or whether this move is an affordance that destabilizes who has the rights to them. These lectures, then, are a preliminary and modest effort to register both the dominant and less obvious sites of the shift by identifying the ambivalent and exemplary forms it takes, and by looking to the changing terrain of ethnographic and historical work that has prompted its embrace and is at the same time its effect. In tacking between this heady push and hesitant retreat, I merely begin here to address how this philosophical inflection at once prompts and responds to the very nature of what counts as a subject and a site of ethnographic and historical inquiry. And this is some of what I'll be setting out in the second lecture next week. In pursuing the forms and contents of this call on philosophy, I draw on a phrase initially used by the ordinary language philosopher John Austin, Fieldwork in Philosophy, attending to how it has been conceived, what it captures today, and in my own rendition, how it might exceed its earlier incarnations. Fieldwork in Philosophy is at once a shorthand for a promise in the past and in the future tense. There are those who have taken it to describe their own work, Pierre Bourdieu and Paul Rabinow, but others, like Rodney Needham, who without calling on that particular phrase, have not only embraced philosophy, but refused to describe their work as anything but it. So let me be clear. Few would argue that philosophy has not been foundational to anthropology. Certainly can't do that in Germany. And avant la lettre of the discipline proper, fundamental to its analytic grammar. A project that explicitly joins anthropology and philosophy is not a new invention. If Lévi-Strauss could dub Rousseau the first anthropologist, Evans Pritchard was to nominate Montesquieu. Old and new histories of the discipline cite Vico, Locke, and Montaigne as well. Even recent histories subscribe to anthropology's status as child of the Enlightenment, with Diderot, Montesquieu, Rousseau ultimately providing the intellectual matrix for the spirit of what motivates what anthropology has become today. Montaigne, Kant, and Locke subliminally and explicitly are seen to have shaped what anthropologists once asked about the human condition, and ethnology in France and anthropology in England and the US wrote their originary myths around Enlightenment philosophers. And then we had Kant and Herder, in Consensus or Conflict, seen as the avatars of philosophy for others. But it seems to be a revised pantheon of philosophical thinking that now pervades the references, with a decidedly different use that is not about anthropology's progenitors or the early history of the discipline. It may register instead a rethinking of the political contours of ethnographic work and how we treat contemporary and emergent problems in the world today. Derrida, Heidegger, Foucault, Deleuze, Guattari, I'm pronouncing Dewey with a French accent. Agamben, Arendt, Butler, Wittgenstein. I'm just going through literally the names of those who are referenced now in anthropology. Barthes, Bachelard, Benjamin, Alston, Hegel do more than make up the major portions of bibliographies. Anthropological predecessors invariably do not. They are almost categorically replaced and displaced. Very little cachet in Anglophone literature is gained by citing earlier ethnographers. I mean, once in a while you get, EP invoked, or Malinowski just to, put down his first look across the sea and his ethnographic authority. But very, very little of the work of a younger generation is looking in that direction. There are exceptions, but it's difficult not to see that analytic insights are at once more fully philosophically inflected and paradoxically more grounded in the critical and creative faculties of those with whom we work, revising what makes up anthropology's proper quarters. Authority is at issue, but so also is a search for new styles of reasoning, as Ian Hacking puts it, how sense and sensibilities figure as key sites of ethical wisdom, that is, of phronesis, and of worldly epistemologies. These entail new kinds of questions and ways of writing that disrupt our conceptual conventions and that strain disciplined capacities. There is neither consensus nor anything unidirectional about these moves. Questions about what demands philosophical citation and authorization remain. When Peter Sloterdijk contends that philosophy's task is, I quote, to strengthen one's inner witness, unquote, those acutely attuned to how our situated knowledge informs ethnographic and historical research could conceivably bristle and argue that if this is philosophy, we don't need it at all. Though I think we do. And there is the question of the ether space in which some philosophy resides. Levi-Strauss might have argued that Rousseau did not anticipate ethnology, he founded it. But as we know, Rousseau spent most of his time studying his own presuppositions and himself. The French anthropologist Pierre Clastres remains an icon of anthropological work among philosophers. We love to quote him, but for his astute reading of primitive politics. But as Samuel Moyne has noted, Clastres' most important work was before he ever set foot in Brazil. What produces an ethnographic inflection in philosophy, or a philosophical one among ethnographers, is asymmetric and unexplored, nor is there agreement on their basic coordinates. So my concern here is not, however, with anthropology's deep history, nor does a philosophical turn really capture the nature of how it's changed. Turns come and go and make way for others. A turn at once diminishes the contemporary intensity of the call on philosophy to a trend. We have the historic turn, the linguistic turn, we have the archival turn, while intimating that somehow philosophy was absent in some other time before. More importantly, it fails to grapple with where philosophy enters the fray and how it does so. Thus, we might entertain one of several provocations. If ethnography has been built on the back of philosophy all along, has philosophy long been anthropology's theory? And does it remain so? And what in that relationship has changed? In the end, what I offer are less firm conclusions than an opening to this spectrum of thin and thick engagements that this nexus of ethnography and philosophy signals, both the flat borrowings engendered as well as the generative practices it suggests. What I hope to trace is the ideology of the shift, the sorts of work it charts, some of the questions it enables, and some of its effects. I take concept work to be a nodal fulcrum of this new space in its emergent and varied forms. At issue is what work we do with concepts and what work we imagine those concepts to do, how they act upon us to both direct and distract analytic and worldly attention, and thus as consequential political forces in themselves. One might think of this effort to distill what fieldwork and philosophy affords as a loosely calibrated measure of the quest for a genre of writing and inquiry that refuses the sharp distinctions once drawn between theoretical and empirical work. I would argue that it potentially resituates the politics of conceptual labor more centrally in ethnographic work and as ethnographic labor. In my own case, it places concept work itself as a fertile site for new histories of the present. My interest in pursuing the possibilities of fieldwork and philosophy is to revision the sources and sites of what counts as a political intervention and what constitutes the political sites of conceptualization across a broader worldly plane. The next section is entitled Risking Possibilities. Alistair McIntyre was probably right to say that attempting to answer what is happening in contemporary philosophy always puts one at risk, particularly if one follows Hegel's injunction that philosophical knowledge can only be retrospective. I'm not sure that a parallel caution applies to anthropology, and especially to ethnography, where auto-critique is our modus vivendi, where reflection on what is on the cusp of revision and rethinking in our own field and among those interlocutors with whom and about whom we work represents an ongoing site of anxious deliberation. Thus, despite the warning, I hazard the effort to identify some of the changing terms in which ethnographic work has been cast, some of the well-identified and more subtle shifts that have made it. And this really depends on one's perspective, and that's where I still remain lodged. More disposed toward philosophy, open to, more needing of, more dependent upon what philosophy has to offer. So that's quite a large range. There's nothing comprehensive about this venture. Significant intellectual spaces are set aside in the lectures that follow. The rich engagements of literature and science studies are left unaddressed, nor do I focus on, I don't know if this is big here, on the ontological term, as differently construed by Philippe de Scola, Viveros de Castro, and Martin Holbrand, among others, though I will have something to say about it in later lectures. Linguistic anthropology and its long-standing phenomenological bent are clearly intellectual spaces in which philosophy has played a central part for some time, and comprise important sites of and evidence for how philosophy has shaped the current contours of our anthropological maps. I do not imagine these spaces as less important, and well, how could one, with the ontological turn washing over Anglophone anthropology with tsunami force. They could not speak as easily, they could speak as easily to the issues at hand. Still, I chose to focus here on the uses and abuses of philosophical inspiration and dissension in the specific domains I most closely work, with colonial archives and imperial governance, post-colonial aftermaths, the politics of sentiment, which are sufficiently profuse, unruly, and provocative. The trajectory of this project over the last 4 years has been a singular obsession, but its openings and challenges are not my own. 2 graduate seminars at the New School for Social Research on ethnography as fieldwork in philosophy provided the occasion, both the grist and the grit, of the queries I pose here. A 2010 Paris Symposium on Fieldwork and Philosophy provided a cautionary tale that distinct traditions and conditions of scholarship matter a lot, as I'm sure they do here. A workshop of anthropologists and philosophers on the same subject organized with my colleague Nicholas Langlitz in 2012 with Vina Glass, Vincent Crapanzano, Marilyn Strathern, range of others, condensed both the clashes in clarity and identifying what features constituted this call. These were generative sites among those that spoke to articulations between philosophy and anthropology long in the making. Some of these people have been dealing with philosophical concepts for years, as well as those on our different speculative and respective horizons. But not surprisingly, this effort to identify the call on philosophy in contemporary social inquiry emerged out of my own work, most pointedly in thinking with and against Foucault, and the contested conversations I imagined having with him over some 3 decades. When I first encountered Foucault and Nietzsche some 25, 30 years ago, I recognized something uncannily familiar, with both awe and arrogance. I had the sense that I had already anticipated some of the very questions they posed. I'm sure many of us felt that way. With respect to Foucault, his attentiveness to the political work that concepts and categories do, to discursive relations that produce their objects, to the history of sentiments and their political animation, and not least to sexuality as a dense transfer point of power, spoke to the occlusive histories of colonial governments that demanded deciphering and that I was in the midst of trying to do. But perhaps the most enduring traction has come from enlisting genealogy to recraft colonial histories of the present. Genealogy, I want to underscore, not as a fashionable substitute term for history, as it's very often used. So everybody's doing a genealogy of whatever it is. Genealogy of religion, genealogy of sex, genealogy of this. But as a subversive analytic methodology, rooted in the politics of detail and the patiently documentary. And what I would contend are still the untapped insights, methodological insights, it offers, so contrary to the prevailing emphasis on Foucault's adherence to discontinuities and epistemic breaks. And this is part of the subject of the 5th lecture. If Foucault, Bachelard, and Desserteau have spoken to my own idiosyncratic trajectory and to the conceptual work of archival labor that so interests me, one can find equally strong engagements in other ethnographic genres with other philosophers. Mittausig's formative and prolonged guidance by Walter Benjamin, in the Heideggerian terms that Keith Basso calls on to locate the ethical wisdom of Native Americans, in Vina Das's protracted pursuit of a decidedly non-conceptual domain to ask how past violences are endured, muffled, and made mute, deeply attentive to the phrasing of those who endure those violences, with Stanley Cavell and Wittgenstein by her side. Or in the more recent challenge to what I quote, ethnographic concept of the concept might be, as posed by the anthropologists Alberto Corsan Jimenez and Rane Willersleeve, working in Siberia. Or in Valentine Daniels' unflinching draw on Peirce's analytic grammar, to write about Sri Lanka's history of ethnic violence in ways that have not been done before. Fieldwork in philosophy, to my mind, is a methodological charge designed to address the resistant features that occlude the self-evident. It attunes us to the breaches of what is self-evident and their political effects. It seeks to render what passes invisibly for the self-evident more available as an object of political inquiry. And in so doing, it tends to how truth claims secure their hold. It sets its sights not only on the ways in which concepts conceal their making or erase the scenes that produce them, as Gayatri Spivak, in a recent conference that I organized on political concepts at the New School, recently succinctly parsed Derrida's insight. I think that's really very nice, that erase the scenes of their making. It expands and amplifies where those scenes are, who participates in them. It looks to the counterintuitive space in which those concepts are nourished, how they travel, and where they lodge. As we shall see, one needn't posit this as a unique venture to make the case, as Bourdieu did, that fieldwork in philosophy offers a vigilant vantage point from which to insist that critique has not, as Bruno Latour argued a decade ago, run out of steam, quote unquote. So let me briefly set out what I'm hoping to do. Today's lecture addresses the personal and political observations that guide this project, as you see. The second examines how fieldwork in philosophy has been understood, both the shared and divergent understandings of what it might entail by those, John Austin, Pierre Bourdieu, and Paul Ravenel, who have explicitly called upon it. I see fieldwork in philosophy, in part, as a potential response to the quest for what Wittgenstein called rough ground. And why doing ethnography might provide that rough ground without assuming that it necessarily does so. And the unstated quote there is from Clifford Geertz, who said it necessarily does. Lecture 3 and 4 address concept work directly, treating concepts not as stable fonts, but filiations of force and fragility. Here I trace the terms colony and camp through a joined genealogy of their conceptual, geographic, and historical appearance, and the logics that define their distribution and their political embrace. In pursuit of an alternative map of imperial formations, I suggest some of the analytic and political purchase that such treatment of the protean quality of concepts affords. Lecture 5, Epistemics in the Flesh, draws on the multiplex field of colonial studies to examine the categories and concepts that have shaped the parameters of inquiry and what sites of imperial practice and what relational histories they foreclose. Fieldwork in philosophy revisions both terms in that phrase. It cannot be defined by concept work alone. It looks to alternative modes of discernment. Blumenberger calls it non-conceptuality. I'm not at all comfortable with the notion that that which is outside of concepts is non-conceptual. But we can talk more about that when I get to it. It looks to the alternative modes of discernment and the productive qualities of doubt, not necessarily the obverse to concept formation, but adjacent to, the underside and less privileged sites of its making, in affect, metaphor, and in the politically charged space between the creative possibilities of sensus communis and the restrictive, consensual force of common sense. Fieldwork in philosophy as a task is animated by that which exceeds the ready concepts on which we might call. It seeks to stretch, I quote, beyond semantic availability, as Raymond Williams defined structures of feeling, to that which hovers on the edges of readily available vocabularies and the ready means assigned to that. The next section is entitled Referential Gestures and Irreverent Acts. To say that philosophy, how are we doing on time? Yes, but that doesn't mean Am I speaking too quickly? Yes? Yes, I feared I might. That's why I wasn't sure if I was going to get through it. As I said, this may take longer, but I promise I won't keep you. Your patience is already appreciated. To say that philosophy has held a commanding presence across the disciplines of social inquiry might be thought too commonplace to know. I mean, really, anybody could say it. Or taken as a contentious, adversarial claim. For some practitioners in anthropology, sociology, political theory, history, philosophy has been the preeminent arbiter of what counts as knowledge. Tout court, the font and funnel of what hails as theory, the source purveyor of conceptual authority. For others, philosophical truths and priorities and the modes sanctioned to assert them have served to provide alternative analytic strategies, to animate what are understood as more empirically sound and practical methodologies, more accessible language, more grounded counterframes. For a larger constituency still, philosophy serves as just the éminence grise. That's it. By which analytic erudition is measured, by which moral questions are given broader relevance, and seemingly particularistic situations garner their general appeal. The fact that philosophy has long occupied this unofficial status and peculiar authority is really less in question than how it does so and how the form and content of that authority has changed. Things philosophical often provide the analytic and aesthetic scaffolding around which the substance of grounded social inquiry is secured. In this case, ethnography provides the instances, sociology, the cases, history, the compilation of details and events for which philosophy is enlisted to provide the accrual of added value. But what these things are, and the forms in which they make their presence felt, are by no means uniform. Is it the applicability of the conceptual frames? I mean, is that what gets people all excited? Or is it the portability of those frames? Is it the stature of philosophy as the font of theory, or the framing of what Alain Badiou defines as decidedly, and he calls them, philosophical situations? When he insists that philosophy, I quote, is first and foremost the invention of new problems that appear in the incommensurability of what he calls, quote, different kinds of thought. Surely anthropology, which has long honed its analytic tools precisely with respect to the nature and limits of knowing different kinds of thought, doesn't need philosophy to pose that question. Or is it something more elusive and implicit that radiates from philosophical texts? Styles of reasoning, as I mentioned before, or the very form that a question takes, modes of query and forms of address? Or is it what George Steiner calls the poetics of thought, and the power of analytic metaphors that allow us to fill in our conceptual landscapes? Or might it reside in the, quote, I quote, the precision of thought, the terms invoked by Peter Sloterdijk to describe the writing of Paul Valéry, not that of philosophy? Philosophical solicitation may be slipped in with a whisper as a barely audible reference, an offhand allusion or boldly proclaim. Some ethnographers wear their philosophical inclinations and commitments lightly, as fine spun silk. Some become tangled in philosophy's cumbersome tailoring. You notice I'm not naming people here. As if ethnography subjects were swathed in philosophical folds. It is not only fledgling graduate students who stumbled awkwardly as if encased under its weighty armor. There is virtually no essay of Clifford Geertz that did not invoke a philosophical citation and then as quickly move away from it. Nor did mere reference to philosophy stop Geertz from claiming that his work could be parsed as anthropological reflections on philosophical topics, the subtitle to his final collection from 2000. Among the many who recognize ourselves perhaps only secretly as philosophile, philosophical epigrams tend to be both reverential gestures and irreverent acts, at once an homage paid to those who have taught us to think differently, a pale hope that significance will be conferred by the company one keeps, tempered by the equal wisdoms of the folk, be they factory workers or financial experts, with whom we work, to whom we listen, esteemed as much or more. Philosophical epigrams, and they are unavoidable, may be posted to alert and cue the reader of what to look for, or how to read, or to provide significance to what they are about to look at. For some, philosophical reference is a grace note, lightly played and precisely posed for the most effect. Others dispense with preparing overtures. Husserl or Heidegger are there from the beginning, their conceptual countenance peering over the pages, daring the reader to reject their advance. But sometimes, such epigrams read as postings of despair, substitutes for what one may not be able to articulate, may know that one cannot achieve or yet know how to say. Our citations can be inadvertent, preemptive notices of a fear of failure as much as aspirations of success. My own treatment is as apt an example as any. When I cited Jean-Paul Sartre's contention, I quote that one never wholly believes what one believes. To launch a difficult exploration in Along the Archival Grain, one of my last books, about the complex interiorities that allowed colonial officials to both know what violences they were part of, to look and then to quickly look away. It is not only with the hope that the reference to Sartre will substantiate what I want to say. As importantly, it marks a promissory note to myself, a challenge rather than a secure claim. In U.S. anthropology, which increasingly sees itself unfettered by disciplinary strictures as transgressive, critically motivated, politically reflexive, committed to redefining what should be the discipline center from perches on its outer edges, it's hard to avoid philosophical saturation. As I've already suggested, not all of this is good news. A philosophical inflection often remains at once the signature of a critical sensibility, and some may argue the jargoned albatross of contemporary ethnography. For access to and dexterity with some of the philosophers upon whom we so easily call demand a long investment. Heidegger at once entices and humbles the boldest of interdisciplinary voyagers. Peirce's intricate neologisms cut off the casually curious from the start, despite Val Daniels' valiant efforts to make them accessible. So some people have argued that his books are more about Peirce than they are about Sri Lanka. As Dominique Boyer recently pointed out, Foucault still flourishes in job talk sound bites on biopolitics and knowledge power. Such ritualized invocations can make those of us who otherwise take pride in our pedagogy feel we need to give up or restart. And then there are Nietzsche's infamous sleights of hand that draw one onto his course as he abruptly does an about-face, twists one's visions, and slices through what he just seemed to offer as stable support. Philosophical reference is both the product and proof of erudition, of one's mastery of abstractures. Can't even speak English. Obstreperous concepts. A transversal dexterity, evinced in citational ease and intellectual breadth, but sometimes it produces difficult writing that can hold the uninitiated at bay. Or as Mark Goodwin notes about Vincent Crapanzano's idiomatic prose that can cut sharply to history's uncomfortable presence in ways that a more straightforward phrasing might not otherwise convey. As I suggested at the outset, I think of this present moment as a new summons, a philosophy in the sense of both a call up and upon, a bringing forth, the making of a request for help and our information that may be read and acted upon as a beckoning and or a demand. Not least, those of us who make that call upon are compelled to account for ourselves as well. One summons one's own courage and calls on something else. But the summons also conveys a possible arrest, a subpoena, a calling to task, a bringing of charges, and a possible exposure. A demand that comes with some risk, with a requirement that the summoned give an account of herself. We might think of the summons and fieldwork in philosophy in yet another way, as a gathering in of the remainders of that which philosophy once relegated to its margins, or worse, treated as opposed to, or even obstacle to, qualified philosophical concerns, that is to Sophia. Phronesis, practical knowledge, common sense, metaphor, in short, those very domains in which ethnography and anthropology more generally have sought to value as sites of critical thought. The summons, then, is not only to philosophy, but of language and practice exiled from its authorized and sanctified domains. The summons' challenge manifests in direct and muted ways. James Boone parsed his own work 24 years ago as, quote, philosophy. James Boone, those of you who don't know him, is an anthropologist, born and bred. His own work 24 years ago as philosophy in practice. Just as Rodney Needham's, quote, exercise in philosophy in 1972 was dismissive of using even the term anthropology to describe his venture. In his extraordinary collected essays, Belief, Language, and Experience, dedicated to Wittgenstein and Lévi-Strauss, Needham referred to his work as an exercise in philosophy, deliberating in the preface as to whether it was best to be understood as, quote, an essay in comparative epistemology or in empirical philosophy, but affirming that he decidedly, I quote, did not want anthropology on the title page, since the word has little useful meaning. Alan Klima more recently refers to his own venture as a philosophical ethnography, to suggest a method that might avoid, I quote, cartographic literalist notions of culture, space, and place. One thing is no longer clear, if it ever was, that many anthropologists would concede to Deleuze and Guattari's categorical assertion in What is Philosophy, that philosophy's unique task is to create concepts and ever new inventions of them, in defining philosophy not as the identification of concepts already operating in the world, but as the proper home of those skilled craftsmen charged with their creation. Their assertion reads as well as a provocation designed to incite, to beckon, and exclude at the same time. Philosophers, they tell us, are, I quote, experts in concepts and in the lack of them, unquote, knowing when we need concepts and when we do not. And so they can write, I quote, so long as there is a time and place for creating concepts, the operation that undertakes this will always be called philosophy. What strikes me is that despite philosophy's uneven presence, the fact of this presence, the changing content of its appearance, is largely off radar, not subject to our usual scrutiny as anthropologists, perhaps considered unseemly, right? Not opposite tasks, but surely among anthropologists. So we're wary of anything that presents itself as second nature, alert to that which is too normal to note, suspect of unspoken common sense, as we've learned, always on the lookout for what passes for the obvious, unreflective quotidian practice. That silence is at once suspect and strange. Citation is seamlessly produced with rarely an interruption. No translation is deemed required. It is merely a sign of our depth and breadth. Such an absent reflection is all the more glaring today, where engagements with philosophical concepts, masters, and texts stretch over such an even terrain. From studied analytic efforts, freshly conceived as in the work of some of those I've mentioned, to this kind of minimalist philosophical citation, this mannered self-endorsement of ethnographic work. To suggest that philosophy as a whole, from ancient to analytic to continental, is making a new unprecedented mark would be an absurd claim. It's not what I'm claiming. Nor am I suggesting that philosophy is a stable, right? Stable of horses, and a stable reserve. The gift of a portable toolkit, as Foucault once unfortunately parsed his job, and which people love to quote. He's got a toolkit and we're just going to kind of take it home, on which others might draw. On the contrary, it may be, as I'm suggesting here, that both anthropology and philosophy have realigned in ways that make the nature of their queries and the problematics that compel them more commensurate with conceptual predicaments that meet and mesh. For an issue is not only using philosophical principles and categories, as has so long been anthropology's practice, but questioning whether the very hardened attributes assigned to what counts as a concept and what figures as epistemology, one of the issues that I'm very concerned with in my own work, are more open to revision and change. Still, the nature of this relationship remains grossly skewed and barely registered, even as a proper exchange. If there are some philosophers like Stan Cavell and Jay Bernstein who argue that the only salvation for philosophy is a turn to the everyday, and Bernstein's assessment, a turn to anthropology, he says, far more would not even notice or care that social inquiry is challenging philosophy's authority. So the reading is not going in both directions. Giorgio Agamben can plummet the visceral politics of the camp as the nomos of the modern and galvanize ethnographic attention and citation ad nauseam. But that doesn't compel him to read the imperial history of camps or ethnography. In a recent New Left Review essay entitled The Anthropological Turn, the Unseen Paradigm in Modern French Thought, the author, Jacob Collins' anachronistic view of anthropology is concerned with, quote, an ancient and invariable social dynamic, and I quote, structuralism, ahistoric insights, unquote, is barely recognizable as our own, much less as a site of productive exchange. Indeed, for many philosophers, philosophical anthropology still refers, as it does in Germany, to the anthropology of Kant and to questions of what is man and what is human nature. If anthropology's subjects are no longer assigned to the savage slut, as Michel Rothtriot once argued they invariably were, it's ironic that for many philosophers, anthropology's purchase still remains tethered to the access it is imagined to provide to something like a savage slut, be it a distant primordial other or pre-modern social space. So if one goes through, I mean, there are exceptions like Bashir, but there are so many philosophers who turn back that it's got to be EP because of the primitive, because of magic. With all the talk of philosophy and anthropology intersecting, dialogues have been surprisingly rare. Ernest Gellner's synthesis of Wittgenstein and Malinowski as iconic masters of divergent theories of knowledge, of approaches to philosophical anthropology, was, as Stephen Lukes noted, unclassifiable, in part because it was played out in Gellner's imaginary. The meeting never occurred. There was a 1960s debate on rationality and the philosophical status of ethnographic knowledge, in which there was Stephen Lukes, Alistair McIntyre, Martin Paulus, Ernest Gellner. These were prominent figures, and then reduxed when Dan Sperber, John Elster joined the conversation 20 years later. Others might think of include Levi-Strauss and Sartre on history, Geertz and Rorty on ethnocentrism, Dreyfus and Rabineau on Foucault's interpretive analytics, Rabineau and Foucault on biopolitics, Vinadas and Stanley Cavell on the everyday, and then most recently Saba Mahmoud, Judith Butler, and Talal Assad on secularism. Some were scholarly jousts. Some significant discussions. Fewer, however, led to sustained collaborations. Sometimes there almost seems to be a passing in the night. When Hannah Arendt, in her 1970 lectures at the New School on Kant's political philosophy, reminds the audience in her sober prose that, I quote, the trick of critical thinking does not consist in an enormously enlarged empathy through which one can know what actually goes on in the mind of all others, but in an enlargement of what one can think and know. Her critical thinking appears pale next to the insight of Talal Assad, who, writing at the very same moment, redefined anthropology's task of cultural translation as a revamping of our own categories and enjoined us to, I quote, to subject ourselves to this transforming power, to test our capacities to accommodate, not only tolerate unaccustomed forms, unquote. For some of us, philosophical modes of inquiry often seem endowed with the capacity to reach into one's most cherished assumptions with the precision of skilled acupuncture, or so subtly assail one's habits of thought and comportment that they take away one's breath. But then again, one could argue that ethnography at its best endeavors to do the same, jolting the reader to the familiarity of the unfamiliar and vice versa, training our attention on what the habits of others are understood to be and do, alerting us thereby to what passes for our own. Few other forms of social inquiry so self-consciously draw upon, worry over, and set themselves apart precisely by reckoning with the strained, unequal, and humbling predicaments of ethnographic situations and the frequently informal and intimate performance of those encounters. The final section that I either can give next time, as I thought might be the case, is on ethnography's changing forms of social inquiry. And what I've tried to do is set out, well, they're not any I've made up, there's nothing particularly creative about them, but to pull together what I see as some of the major shifts in what constitutes ethnography, what constitutes an ethnographic object, and how we moved away from a priori community studies, studying a community, to studying that which creates those communities and the objects around their created. But perhaps, given that it's already 7:30, Herr Professor, shall I continue? It's only 5 pages, and or were people rather open to discussion? It's a long time to sit.
Rather open to discussion.
So I will leave this. It may actually be important in terms of the questions that you might ask, but if we can just suspend that. And then I'll go into looking at the very interesting ways in which Austin called upon fieldwork and philosophy, and the moves that Bourdieu and Rabinow made with it, and what they left aside. So, thank you very much.